Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I'm here to talk to you about Star Trek, Strange New Worlds, and really the whole Discovery-verse that sprang it, and the rest of Star Trek, with which these prequel shows just do not line up. And I'm here to talk about it because it's a continued point of contention in the fandom. I belong to a couple of different Star Trek groups just on Facebook, and there are continual, I'll say, discussions, really they're arguments, about whether or not these shows, and Strange New Worlds in particular, are in the same universe as the original series and everything that came after it. And these conversations are becoming more frequent as the show goes on because they keep changing things. And I think it's gotten to a point now where the question has to be settled, and also to a point where there's really no other way to settle it but for the powers that be, Paramount Plus, to come out and say, you know, we said at the outset that this show and Discovery were in the same universe, and that was certainly our intention, but as time has gone on, we've made some story choices that we felt were best for the show, which have made it impossible for us to continue to say that the continuity lines up, and therefore we are going to declare these shows to be in a separate universe. That will never happen, but that's what should happen. And I think because that's the case, the fandom just has to acknowledge it on its own. The fandom just has to stop, or half of it anyway, has to stop pretending that this show is in the same universe as the rest of Star Trek, and acknowledge that regardless of what the powers that be say, and regardless of what it says on paper, you know, from them, in practice, the show is not in the same universe. And I'm going to give you a very short list of reasons why that are recent or semi-recent. And believe me, this is just a fraction of the list of things that just don't jibe between these prequel shows and the rest of Star Trek. There are a ton more that I've noticed at one time or another that I've forgotten. There are a ton more that I never noticed myself until someone else pointed them out to me. And usually that person is the nitpicking nerd on YouTube. He's got a fantastic memory, and he notices discrepancies left and right. And you should check out his channel and his videos. He also has a channel under Major Grin, which is in the same vein. It points out discrepancies. And there's just, between the ones I've noticed myself and between the ones I've had pointed out to me, there are just too many now. The show is going on, and they keep having discrepancy after discrepancy, and there are just too many for it to be considered in the same universe. So let me give you a quick list. In the episode of the original series, Arena, Captain Kirk encounters the Gorn, okay? And he's never heard of them. He's never heard of the Gorn. And nobody on the ship, Spock, Scotty, are shown ever explaining to him who the Gorn are. Though they obviously know, because we've seen them deal with the Gorn on Strange New Worlds. And you could almost let that go and say, well, they just didn't feel inspired to explain to him who they were. And, you just got to understand that he somehow just didn't know about the Gorn, even though they were known to Starfleet. And people did say that in the beginning when they first started showing the Gorn on this show. There's nothing directly showing that Kirk had heard of them. And it's like, okay. But now it's to a point where it's just ridiculous to maintain this charade that it makes sense that he didn't know. Why? Because in the most recent episodes involving the Gorn, there was like a full-scale invasion of Federation space. Okay. Are we supposed to believe that word of this never got to the Farragut? All kinds of people all over Starfleet know about the Gorn, which we know from towards the end of last season. Or across, parts of the Federation. And Captain Kirk didn't? It makes no sense. And look, in this most recent encounter with the Gorn, his own brother was held captive by the Gorn. So that was never mentioned. I mean, I know he dies later on, Sam Kirk, but he didn't tell his brother. It's just ridiculous. In the very most recent episode, the medical ensign Gamble there lost his eyes, and they put a thing on his head and said they were going to regenerate his eyeballs. Now, it didn't happen because his brain was dead because of what had happened to him, but There was no such technology in that era. And we know this because there was no such technology 100 years later. Because Geordi had to wear the visor, right? And when Dr. Pulaski told him in the second season of Next Gen that she could regenerate his eyes, it was something that had only been done twice before by her, and that it was risky. The doctor on Voyager had to make a fake eye for Seven of Nine to replace the one she lost to the Borg. Nog, when he lost his leg, was given a quasi artificial, quasi flesh leg. There was no limb generation technology. In one of the most recent episodes, they dealt with the holodeck. Now, they tried to cover it up by saying, well, it doesn't really work, so that's why we're not going to install it in starships. But when you see the holodeck in Next Gen, first of all, it's brand new technology, going by how people talked about it. And it isn't any better. It still does all the same crazy stuff that the one shown in this recent episode did. It's no better. It hasn't improved in 100 years. That just doesn't make any sense. So it can't be the same universe. And look, Scotty clearly doesn't know about the holodeck in Relics. When he shows up on the Next Generation, he has never heard of a holodeck before, never seen one. But he operates the thing and keeps it running on Strange New Worlds. Geordi speaks to him in Relics as if he wouldn't know about a holodeck. Now, if he were any other crewman, you could say, well, maybe that crewman wasn't up on when holodecks, were first tested and whatnot. It's Geordi. He knows. So it's just ridiculous. And, you can say, well, there's a sort of a side problem with that because they had similar technology in the animated series. It was called the Rec Room, and they even referred to it that way in Strange New Worlds. And so that even complicates it further. The thing about that is the animated series over the years has been part of canon and not part of canon at different times according to Paramount or CBS. So even if you say, okay, well, it is canon now, and so that complicates it. Okay, yeah, it complicates it, which just means that you can't. It's worse than that, okay? Because, and this goes back to what I was saying, it's not the same universe. If you count the animated series as canon, then Admiral April is white, not black, in whatever universe the animated series is in. And he's black on Strange New Worlds. So I guess it comes down to whether or not you feel like that show is canon, but if you don't, then you can't talk about how, no, holodeck technology did exist before Next Gen because we saw it in the animated series. Yeah, but we also saw that April was white. And so that takes us back to this show, Strange New World is not in the same universe. Why doesn't Spock know Dr. Corby in the original series? Why doesn't Trelane recognize Spock or mention being familiar with the Enterprise crew in the Squire of Gothos? In Amok Time, why doesn't Uhura know who T'Pring is? Back to the thing with Dr. Corby in that episode, why doesn't Nurse Chapel know that Spock's been engaged before? Why on Discovery could they do transporter beams within the ship when that wasn't done? And when Spock said in an original series episode that the reason it wasn't done is because it was too dangerous. Why did the eugenics wars now happen in a different era? Well, because the Romulans interfered with the timeline. Okay, but when you watch the original series, they're still said to have happened when the original series said they happened because they can't change that. So if you watch them straight through, I mean, you could say, well, they haven't gone back and made the change yet. So they made the change later. But, and then you get to deal with causality and how timelines work. But okay, so maybe they get a gimme on that one. But, it's much easier, instead of having to do that, to count this show as being in another universe. I want to talk about one more thing real quick, and that's the uniforms. The first uniforms we ever saw were the ones on Where No Man Has Gone Before, and they are very similar to the ones seen in the Menagerie, which timeline-wise predates Where No Man Has Gone Before. So those are the oldest Star Trek uniforms of the original series era, the ones from the Menagerie, and they're these velour tops that were also used in Where No Man Has Gone Before. Strange New Worlds has acknowledged that those shirts were once the uniform when they showed a picture of Captain Pike wearing one of them with the black Robert April in either his quarters or April's office or somewhere. So that picture exists, so they acknowledge that those shirts existed. So that's fine, because what happens is we went from the velour tops of that era in both universes to the tunics that were worn on the original series in the original series universe. So that's a clear line of progression that makes complete sense if you look at the style, okay? The only fly in the ointment there is the uniforms on Enterprise, but that was the early 21st century or the late 21st century, and those were modeled after NASA jumpsuits, basically. So that makes sense, and then they just made a crazy change 2 centuries later. And that's fine, but then the progression makes sense. Now, after the original series, they get a little wonky with the pajama uniforms from Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and then they make a complete jump again to the Monster Maroons of Star Trek II, but then from there, the progression starts to make sense again because they keep those for a very long time. Then they change them slightly by removing the belt and the tunic, and then they go back to jumpsuits, which is fine, but they maintain the sort of red and black and add in back in the other colors for the other divisions, and they swap them a little bit, but it kind of makes sense. They went for the big fluffy thing, this whole uniform with the fluffy collar, then they took out the collar and changed it a little bit, and then sort of maintained the colors and went to the jumpsuit, and then the jumpsuits had an evolution going forward, which is fine. It all makes sense. What doesn't make sense is the progression that we're supposed to believe took place if both of these shows are in the same universe, because they went from the jumpsuits to the velour tops, back to Discovery era jumpsuits that were blue, to the same jumpsuits with division colors, to the shirts they have now on Strange New Worlds, all the way back to the velour tops for Where No Man Has Gone Before, which comes after, and then to the tunics we're familiar with from the original series. That doesn't make any sense for a uniform progression. It just doesn't. No outfit would do that. Now, the reason the show did it is because they wanted the uniforms on Strange New Worlds to resemble the ones that everyone remembers from the original series. And so they decided to sort of gloss over the fact that the velour tunics were still being used after that period that the show takes place in, because it was one episode and they're hoping, the fans will overlook it, because they didn't want to go with those uniforms because, first of all, they're not great. And secondly, they're not the iconic uniforms that everybody remembers from Star Trek. So they're making decisions that, make sense for various reasons, but they do not lend themselves to a through line of continuity. There's just no way this is the same universe. And it's time that were acknowledged. And that's my very short list. And there's a much bigger list, as I said, and you can Google this stuff. But that's my evidence that I'm going to give you in this video. Otherwise, I'd be here forever. In closing, I just want to say again, and Spock even said it, right? Spock in Star Trek VI quotes his ancestor, which has now been sort of confirmed, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who said in the voice of Sherlock Holmes that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains must be true. It is impossible that these shows are in the same universe at this point. So what remains is that they are not, and that must be true. It doesn't matter what the powers that be over at Paramount are saying, because they can say that they've made you a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, but when you look at it and smell it and taste it, if it is in fact a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, then it's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It isn't a BLT just because they own the ingredients and they own the kitchen and they compiled the sandwich and say that it's a BLT. It's still a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So Star Trek Strange New Worlds is not in the same universe as the original series. And whether the powers that be ever admit that or not, the fandom has to accept it. To quote Orwell, or paraphrase Orwell, don't just accept what the powers that be tell you when it clearly conflicts with what your eyes and ears and senses tell you. Because to do so would be to allow yourself to be gaslit. And that's really all I have to say for now. And I would love to have a discussion about it in the comments. But for now, I'm going to get out of here. I'll be back with another video soon. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.